Welcome to the ONTIC Protective Intelligence Podcast. I'm Dr. Marisa Randazza with ONTIC's Center for Connected Intelligence. After nearly 3 decades of experience working in security and protection, first at the U.S. Secret Service and then in the private sector, I'm delighted to have a chance to sit down with fellow security professionals here to discuss a wide array of current issues in the fields of security and protection. This podcast explores the turbulent world of risk, security, and protective strategies through conversations with leaders in the field. Now, on to the discussion. I have 2 guests joining me today for our discussion about guarding the guardians, mental health and wellness among security professionals. First, Ariane Avila. She currently leads security operations, executive protection, global intelligence, threat management, and security technology and strategy for Capital One. She is also co-executive sponsor and a founding member of Global Security Pride, a group dedicated to supporting, connecting, and elevating the LGBTQIA+ community and allies within the security field. Also joining us is Brian Parent, an intelligence and security consultant known for his expertise in human intelligence, geospatial intelligence, and threat assessment and management. Brian has spearheaded intelligence program enhancements at major social media companies, serving as a conduit between tactical and strategic intelligence. He currently manages the PRISM team at LinkedIn, providing protective and risk intelligence solutions management. Ariane and Brian, welcome to the ONTIC Protective Intelligence Podcast. It's wonderful to have you with us today.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Sure. So let me start out. I'm going to ask this question to both of you, but Ariane, let me start with you first. Would just love a brief introduction from you, and then also a little bit about your background in security and in supporting mental health issues among security professionals.
So Ariane Avila, and I currently lead the security operations and solutions team at Capital One. I've been here at Capital One for a little over 2 years. The team that I lead is responsible for executive protection, threat management, the GSOC, the global intelligence and travel security team, security strategy and technology. So quite a big remit there. Previous to Capital One, I spent almost 24 years at Bank of America. 14 of those were spent in the on the corporate security team. Everything from an analyst to an intel manager to leading governance to communications to deputy CSO. So quite a bit of experience. Starting within the teams, but then also leading teams as well. My background with mental health is, I started off, going to school studying psychology and criminology, really with the intent to get into academia with the purpose of helping others. And at the time, I was studying LGBT hate crime victimization. And particularly was interested in coping mechanisms and how that population would, responds to, what's happening currently, around. But then also, what are the things that can do to help others, not just from that population, but as we think about traumatic events in general, how does that carry forward? And kind of growing up in the security industry. Being exposed to those things, and one day, knowing that I would be a leader and being able to enact change or put some things in place to be able to help with and provide these resources for others is something that's very near and dear to my heart.
Thank you. This is going to be great to hear your perspective as we go through our conversation today, not only as a security practitioner, but all the thought you were already giving to how can you then lead within this industry, and what change can you bring about? Brian, same question for you. A little bit about your background and also your experience in supporting mental health among security professionals.
Absolutely, and thanks again for having me. So my name is Brian Parent. I work at LinkedIn. I lead our PRISM team, stands for Protective and Risk Intelligence Solutions Management, but PRISM so much easier to say. Our team really focuses on providing your standard protective intelligence in products supporting our protective services team, but also our global events team, our broader operations. We also have a really good partnership with our GSOC intelligence analysts, kind of providing input to both kind of that tactical level security concerns, but looking at broader, big picture strategic stuff. But it was a sharp realization a couple of days ago when I realized that I had started my journey in intelligence about 19 years ago in a couple months, and that certainly helps put into perspective the time spent. But I started out in Army military intelligence, went into some graduate work in academia there for a few years, and then despite having coming out with a graduate degree in Homeland Security, assuming that I was just going to end up at some alphabet soup agency and buying lots of suits. I got a call from the private sector asking, to join help with a social media company's tactical intelligence team, and then about 5 years ago, I got the call from LinkedIn, and I moved over here. As far as mental health goes, like, it started off as Arian said, just wanting to be a good leader and taking care of your teams. But it got very personal for me in October. During kind of some of those early month attacks in Israel, kind of just a culmination of a lot of things. And I had a pretty dark space myself and started to have some kind of suicidal ideational thoughts. And thankfully, I have an amazing wife, a wonderful dog, and I was able to turn to them for help pretty quickly. But as an analyst at heart and being curious, I do start to wonder a little bit more about, like, why did this happen? What were the things that I could have done better to try and mitigate things and get my resiliency up. And so I spent the past few months really kind of deep diving into this and trying to figure out, what can I do better? What can I do better for myself? What can I do better as a leader? What can we do better as an industry? Because I think there's a lot that we can certainly lean into to try and improve the space that we work in our mental health and resiliency.
Brian, thank you so much for sharing that, and it's to know that you are bringing up a personal and a recent personal experience to this conversation is incredibly helpful. But I also have such admiration for your analytical mindset. Like, okay, so this happened to me. What can I learn about it? For your own well-being, to improve resiliency, as you were talking about, but also then had it to lead in around this space and look at ways that we can make change. I would say that so first of all, you're not alone in your being startled that you're in 19 years in the security industry. I realized the other day I've hit 30 years in the security industry, and it can only now believe that I probably started at like the age of 10 or 11. That's the only explanation that we've been in it that long. But I think that the more we have this discussion, and this is why I'm so delighted that both of you are joining the podcast today for this discussion, the more that we have this discussion openly around our own experiences, around our colleagues' experiences, and what we can do to help, the more help we're going to be able to give, the more we can normalize this. This is part of the stress and strain of working in the security industry generally. And so I'm just really appreciative that you shared that, and we'll get a chance to talk about those resources and stuff as we go on. Let me start for a little bit. Arian, what have you seen in terms of sort of the state of the industry? Have things changed, or how has the state of the industry changed generally? And then kind of let's talk about the impact on mental health.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the environment definitely feels like it's not getting any slower, especially coming out of the pandemic, right? It feels like, it feels like at one point we were listening at 1.5. Now it feels like we're listening at three times speed as we think about the things that we're working on a daily basis and an exposure to. I mean, we're talking about advancements in technology. I mean, geopolitics. I mean, evolving regulations. Like all of these things kind of keep us busy, and the risks, not just the risks themselves, but also internally within companies, are just becoming more and more interconnected. I love how Rachel Briggs describes it as sort of like this pinball effect. I love how she's, because when you release the ball, it kind of goes this way, this way, this way. It just feels like that within companies. And then if you're one of many that I've talked to, that coming out of the pandemic, like a spotlight was put on you and your team, identifying like the capabilities that your team is able to perform. I mean, which is a good thing. But also too, there's a flip side of that where I think the expectations are higher. Just the added pressure of that spotlight, but then also sort of having to lead with less or do more with less. And really just in some organizations they're stretched. They're like, they only have a handful of people to deal with those things that we had just talked about, and it feels like there's no opportunity to take a break, which I think leads to some of that burnout. But just thinking about where we're at today and kind of how that's evolved, it really just feels like it keeps coming. And the fact that we're talking about this today, I think couldn't be even more timely, because to the impact of like what that does, not just on the work itself, but really talking about the impact of what this does personally, and how this is impacting your own wellness in just trying to work, right, and just coming to work. how is that impacting you?
Yeah. And I think that's so well put. And you're right. The pinball analogy from Rachel Briggs is great because and the pinball analogy, I think, is a great one, especially because it shows, it puts sort of, it highlights how for security professionals, this increase in volume, increase in threats, increase in kind of the breadth of risk that in organizational security, you've got to think about and try to get ahead of. That pinball aspect also, I think, helps to illustrate that I feel like under this added volume, we end up being on our back foot more. We end up being in a reactive more. We're sort of like, okay, we want to go in this direction, but yet we hit this wall in terms of increased volume, broader scope, and so we get slung in a different direction. And so I think you're right. That really helps to describe the ongoing chronic stress that so many in the security industry, whether it's in corporate protection, executive protection, if it's in, government agency work that all of us are facing. So Brian, let me ask you this. What have you seen in terms of the impact of that on day-to-day mental health, stress, things like that among security professionals?
Sure. Hey, yeah, and it's a great question because when I was thinking about leading up to our chat here today was we have become very efficient, as mentioned, doing more with less. And so we have technology, we have all these tools, and we're getting better in our human-based like Boolean logic searches, but also machine learning, all these things that are consolidating and kind of concentrating some of this traumatic content that we're viewing. And it's, I just remember when I would start in open source stuff, if I were going through a social media feed, I would see, the concerning content, but then I'd probably have 5 or 6 things that would make me laugh. And so it was a nice little break. But now we're getting so much better at things, and our tools are better, and that's great for efficiency. But now we're becoming more efficient in ingesting this content. And so I think, we've done so good doing that so far. But I think maybe there would be some thought now at this point to be like, well, what is the impact does this have? And can we use some of this technology that we have been getting to do more with less to help aid in our process of taking care of ourselves and building up resiliency. I mean, when I started in the military, it was, if you can't handle this, get out, suck it up, or move on, kind of stuff. And I even as I started to get into the academic and my first steps into the private sector, we just didn't talk about it. And I saw, the first time that I saw anything was this, as we are wont to do, kind of the gallows humor. It was an article by Heather Williams called "Don't Tell Your Non-Work Friends About the Decapitations," and it was a piece just on trauma by analysts. And I think we're starting to talk about this stuff. I think it's great we're having these conversations, but I would love to see like these conversations, and as we get into awareness, kind of move from like they're in breakout rooms right now. Like, let's get this in a keynote speech. Like, let's have this front and center. So I see us on the path, but I also see us as a security industry very, very far behind other professions. And so I think, one of the places I turned to a lot was kind of viewing how journalists and researchers are handling this. And they have an abundance of research and tools. And we're just kind of sitting here on like Gilligan's Island, like the last one's coming. So, so I think it's, we've gotten the conversation started. It's better than it was before. That doesn't quite make it good yet.
One thing that's interesting, if I can add, is that if I think about the security industry when I first started to the industry today, I definitely think that there's more access to professional resources than ever before. Like we're talking about wellness in general aspects more than we ever have before. And as I think about this generation behind us, Gen Z that's coming up, like they've had helplines and resources have started earlier for them in schools and colleges, and that's sort of carrying over to the workplace and expectations in the workplace. And while while there seems to be a lot less stigma, especially if I was having coffee the other day and eavesdropping on the workers or the employees next to me. It's like that the sentence around like, well, my therapist says this or my therapist says that. Like it's like this therapizing of of guidance and I guess my point there is that, yes, Brian, like security still has a long way to go, but I also feel like as a society, there definitely feels like there's a lot less stigma and there's so much more openness to just talking about and embracing that. Yeah, hey, I need help.
And I think it's gotten a lot better, especially considering, again, kind of from the military perspective or the government perspective, like, you brought this up before, and people start questioning essentially your livelihood, because they're like, "Are you going to be able to keep your security clearance?" and just things like that. And again, we've gotten better. We're discussing it more. I want to believe that for folks who have security clearances, bringing these issues up is a more, I don't know, everyday matter, but I don't know. I couldn't tell you for sure. And I think the fact that there's a question there means we aren't quite there yet.
We'll get back to the conversation in just a moment. But first, I want to tell you about ONTIC's Center for Connected Intelligence. In the world of safety, security, and protection, we know that sharing information is crucial. That's why we created the ONTIC Center for Connected Intelligence. The center is a hub for the ongoing exchange of security strategies and best practices, insights on current and past trends, and sharing valuable information through expert discussion and analysis. It's made up of subject matter experts with decades of experience across a wide range of disciplines. To find blogs, podcasts, webinars, white papers, and more, check out the center by visiting ontic.co/center. That's ontic.co/center. I really like the frame of wellness because I feel like there's still a stigma among security professionals, and I think it's going away. So, Arian, absolutely to your point, but I think so much of the, I'm going to call them well experienced slash seasoned security professionals that are in leadership positions now who've been in security for a couple of decades really kind of were raised in a different time where you didn't talk about these things. I mean, when I went through my background check for my Secret Service security clearance, back in the dark ages in like the late 90s, you couldn't have ever gone through therapy and sort of get a security clearance at the time. Now, fortunately, that has changed dramatically, but the only therapies that were accepted at the time were grief therapy or marital therapy. And so the guidance that I was given was, hey, if you've ever gone through any therapy, list it as grief therapy, bereavement therapy. Otherwise, you're not going to get your security clearance. The reality is, for whether it's in, security clearance positions, private positions, we want people to be out there getting help if they need it, but it doesn't have to necessarily, it can be in a therapeutic setting. It can be through, through a text app. It can be through any type of wellness. And I think if we can use that wellness frame, that can be helpful to sort of take the stigma out as well. But I also, I feel like as we're talking about the impact of this, Brian, you raised such an important point because I have been thinking about this, and as Arian, as you said so well, our industry has changed in that we are facing a greater volume of things. But at the same time, I hadn't thought about the content of a lot of what we're facing. And so, Brian, to your point, as an analyst and you're looking at content and you don't get that break of like, hey, I'm looking at the funny memes on someone's social media feed along with the dark stuff that I'm keeping an eye out for. That the content of what security professionals do can have just as much of an impact as the added volume and breadth of risks and threats that we're facing now. So let's talk for a second about what, like, we started to talk about kind of the what do we do about it. So let's start by the raising awareness piece. So Arian, what do you, in terms of raising awareness or setting expectations, resetting expectations around security professionals and mental health and wellness, what are your thoughts on that? And how do we do that well?
Yeah, I mean, it starts with, especially if you're in a leadership position, you have, and you have the authority and the power. Like, if you're in a leadership role, you're able to really set the tone and set the climate for the team. And I think it really starts there, and it starts with the awareness. And if you think about this idea of culture of care, we have that. We have that here in, kind of where I'm at Capital One, and our tagline is how can we help, but also not just how can we help our partners, our clients, but it's how can also we help each other. And setting that tone from the top, feeds into not just how you expect your team to be able to, to be able to help each other, but also in how you build your teams and how you do the work. I mean, if you think about everything from like, hey, when you first come to this team, you have your onboarding, that you do. And part of that onboarding should be, hey, like, you may experience events that may, impact your mental health. And number one, that's okay. That's expected. But also two, raise your hand. There are resources. And here are the things that we do as a team for that. So upfront, like being upfront about it, I think is key. But then, like I mentioned around like how you build your teams, I mean, like, do you have enough people where people can take breaks? Do you have single points of failure? Like, are you putting your team in positions where just the very nature of the work that they do and how they're set up actually adds to the stress and the burnout? So again, I mean, I really think it starts with the leader in setting that tone, but also, how we work and prioritize, and it not just being a one and done. It's got to be like a continued, and a continued assessment. And like when an event does happen, what does that look like from the leader, right? The immediate fast follow response to align necessary resources and providing that support. And again, I can't stress it enough about the socialization also to other leaders and other executive senior leaders, because you're going to also need that to drive advocacy and resource support. And if you're not sharing these are the things that you need, I think also particularly with your HR department, your benefits team, like, are there other things that would benefit not just security, but also other parts of the organization? And just continuing to raise awareness of that, I think will just continue to, be a force multiplier from a benefits and HR perspective, especially as you think about what resources are continuing to evolve and be added to the slate.
Yeah, and I think the leading by example can't be. This isn't cliche here. You really have to see. You have to see security leaders and organizational leaders take time off visibly, talk about resources that they're using, talk about their own struggles. I mean, one of the things that we've seen post COVID that's been so helpful is really this authenticity in leadership, where people are like, "Hey, I'm human. This was not this like." And looking back now, I think I've been leading in a way that's been impaired for a while. I haven't brought my best self because I've been in this reactive mode, or I've been dealing with stresses at home along with work. I think it's really important what you were saying, just to have that advocacy very visible and and very clear. And I think at the same time that might require some education of our leadership, right? Because some of our leaders aren't aren't fluent in this, aren't well versed. They may still be bringing that mindset of, yeah, I only got 2 hours of sleep last night. I work 90 hours a week, as if that's a good thing. And it's like, no, that's going to make you a bad leader or a bad practitioner in the long run. You're not going to bring your best self.
Absolutely. Like, that's a time management issue. Like, that's not something to brag about, in my mind. Or like you said about leading by example, like, when you go on break, go on break. Like, when you're on vacation, like, stop responding, or, because others are going to think that that's how to really, really take a break.
Yeah.
I'm so guilty of this, eating lunch at my desk. Like, I really need to do, I really need to do a better job
Right.
at that.
And I think there was a line at actually the ONTIC conference that I think I heard there. Uh, you get what you celebrate, and we should be loud and proud to be like, hey, I'm taking some time off. Hey, I'm going doing this. Hey, like I got a doctor's appointment. I'm taking off. Like,
Yeah.
I'll be back on later. Just champion that from yourself so that your teams know to champion that for themselves, and to foster that environment where bringing this stuff up is more of a, hey, you take care of yourself first, because then I know that you're going to come ready to help the team and help your teammates. And we're all just going to be a lot more honest about where we're at, and like, I can deal with this content today, maybe somebody else can't. Maybe I can't deal with this content today, somebody else can. Like, and that goes to Arian's point as far as, like, is your bench deep enough? Like, do you have enough people? Because there are a lot of very small or single point of failure kind of intel shops these days.
Brian, it's such a good point. Your quote was from Dan Heath, who was one of the keynote speakers at our ONTIC summit, and he wrote this book, Upstream. I was just thinking about another line in Upstream that I had read recently. He talks about, so Upstream is Dan Heath's book about sort of solving problems and crises before they occur. And from a security standpoint, so got some incredible take home points. But one of them is that, it's great when people come in and save the day. But if you look at, like, if you have this chronic need for kind of a hero moment, someone coming in and saving the day, it means that there's something systemically wrong with your process or your system or something like that. So and I think for security practitioners especially, we've had hero moments. There's a intrinsic reward to hero moments. Thank goodness Brian was there to do this. Thank goodness Arian was there to do that. And so we get rewarded, like, oh yeah. But the reality is, if we're having those often or more than just rarely, it may mean that there's a systemic issue. Like, we need that deep bench. We need alternates. We need backups for things so that you don't have those single points of failure. I think it's great. So Brian, I'm really glad you raised that. I want to back up one second too, to add in something, because Brian, you were talking about the mindset when you're in your military service around just, hey, if you can't take this, get out. I think one thing that people often don't understand about trauma and the impact of the work that we do is something that I learned kind of late in my career, but I've it's really kind of changed how I think about this. And that is that the impact of trauma is, there's a great analogy that's sort of like metal fatigue. You can have a piece of metal and you can bend it 8 times and it bends. And on the ninth time, you're bending it with the same amount of force or maybe even less, and it breaks. When we think about kind of trauma can have, we can withstand oftentimes a lot of stuff. Maybe we've gone through something big, some critical incident, and we're still able to continue on, had those, able to kind of process it, move on, go back to our job. And then it's a little thing. It's that one social media post, that one case you're working on, that one decapitation I mean, I love the title of that. Like, don't tell your friends about decapitation. But you've got that one incident that you think, my gosh, this is so much smaller than what I've dealt with before. Why is this impacting me? But it is, and it's not. And it may be that that's that ninth bend, that point that things break, and then you do need to go in and do repair, and you do need to and take some time. And sometimes that little additional trauma is the literal straw that broke the camel's back. It brings back all the other stuff that you thought that you had processed and you'd actually just kind of forced through. So then I just think I wanted to share that kind of from my psychological background, my background as a psychologist, of this is something where I think people often don't realize, why are you having trouble with this little thing? We question ourselves. We may question our colleagues, but it's that we don't know all the other stuff they've gone through and already processed. And this may be the one thing that just makes everything more difficult to deal with.
Yeah, and I think there's a quote at the beginning of one of the books that I read through. It's this book called Graphic Trauma and Meaning in Our Online Lives by some Berkeley instructors, Dr. Alexa Koenig and Andrea Lampros. But at the beginning, they lead with a quote that says, the expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to walk through water without getting wet. That's by Dr. Rachel Remen, and it's a great quote, and it just makes me think about, like, we are, we use the analogy like, oh man, I'm up to it, like the water's at my head or just at my head or something. Like, we're kind of always in it. And I know, like, the quote has been thrown around as the perma crisis or whatnot, but I mean, just when you're security intel, once you step into the shop, like, you're switched on. You're at that elevated place. And I do think it's an important point to, like, you mentioned, like, oh, this small thing now has hit me, and I think this is the distinction. And I know in standard, layman's use, secondary and vicarious trauma are kind of used interchangeably, but like, vicarious trauma is that repeated, and it's that worldview shift. There's another great book out there by Stephanie Fu called What My Bones Know, and it's about complex post-traumatic stress disorder. It's about how all this stuff builds up. And then secondary trauma is like, oh, it's a little bit more immediate. But trauma, the effects are the same, whether it's the small thing or the big thing. We're dealing with things in bulk, and we're dealing with the sharp attack in the moment. Like, we're, as you mentioned, just trying to destigmatize all that and be like, this happens, and be okay with it, and be a leader that says, hey, you're not, like, this isn't feeling good. Like, today, you can't work on this product. Like, that's cool. I got Bob in the back. He's ready to go. Like, kind of stuff.
So, Ariane, let me turn to you about this. I wanted to just kind of, again, feel like this is a chance for us to kind of educate everyone who's out there. So I want to talk about when we look at security professionals who have been impacted by trauma, and when we kind of share my perspective on this, and then see if there's anything you have to add or examples or anything like that. One of the things that I find really interesting is that people often, that we talk about PTSD. It's a formal diagnosis, right? And there's actually been this great movement to change PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, change the name to post-traumatic stress injury, because it is really a brain injury, and we need to treat it like a broken bone, right? And that helps to take the stigma away. But at the same time, I think we often have this version and vision of what PTSD may look like, or what chronic trauma, chronic stress, toxic stress, any term you want to use, might look like in ourselves and in our colleagues. We often have this Hollywood version in our mind of like, oh, that person, they can't have PTSD because they don't have a flashback. We think of flashbacks and like they're caught in the moment and a car backfires, or there's a loud noise and they get startled, and then they're sort of like in brain fog and in sort of mentally not there in a place that trauma. One of the things we know about trauma now, chronic stress, toxic stress, PTSD, PTSI, is that we often can see chronic versions of that are at lower levels, and it presents it actually, you'd experience it if you have it, or if your colleague has it, as more kind of like chronic physical symptoms. So insomnia, but also digestive issues, GI issues, chronic headache, it can actually show up as vision problems. I mean, it's the level of things that can be traced back to, hey, this actually is a reaction to trauma. We see so many cases of people who eventually get diagnosed with PTSD or PTSI that came because they went to physical doctor after physical doctor. I've got heart palpitations. Is there a cardiac issue? No, there's no cardiac issue. I've got digestive issues. Is there a GI issue? No, there's no GI issue. So doctor after doctor, physical doctors rule things out, but those symptoms are still there. And in a way, that's the analogy I was given was that's kind of trauma knocking at the door, like, hey, you need to take care of this. It's bubbling up. You can't just push it down anymore. We often see this with people who develop substance use and substance abuse issues on the job because they're trying to self-medicate because they've got chronic anxiety, they have insomnia, things like that. So things that we may see as individual symptoms, if we're experiencing them, if our colleagues are experiencing them. And one of the things I have found, I've seen some organizations do well, is give this information to spouses too, so that the spouses of security professionals, the partners of security professionals, can be on the lookout as well. Because oftentimes we're the last to be able to see it in ourselves. But we can keep a protective approach to our colleagues and keep an eye on each other in a way and look for these things.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad that you said that, because I think it's one thing, where we talk about, in the work that we do, it's people first. But I think sometimes we forget people first also means the team and the people that are around you that are actually doing the work. And if you're not able, or if you're not aware of what some of that may look like, then how do you know to help, right? And I think that what you talked about this Hollywood version of what of what we would expect to see is really that really just comes down to understanding baseline behaviors of your team and your teammates, and some of those smaller things could really mean something bigger. I mean, you talk about some of the physical. I mean, I think the physical reactions, the psychological reactions, and even some of those behavioral changes that happen as a result of stress, just in general. I mean, like physically. I mean, you talked about kind of the tiredness, the irritability, things like that, and then some of the psychological reactions of just just being distant, right, or feeling isolated, and just things that used to bring you joy don't bring you joy anymore, and or wanting to work more or wanting to work less. I mean, all of those smaller things, I think, really add up. And I think knowing your team, knowing your teammates, and understanding those behavioral changes, I think, are the key to really understanding, recognizing, what, that they may be under stress, and then in turn asking them how you could help.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that falls into the expectation of what a leader should be doing, and understanding that there is no a cookie cutter way that somebody responds, or to trauma, and uh, some of the best practices that I've been coming across more are really what, as Arian mentioned before, like making sure people know what they're kind of getting into, and having the leader find out what somebody knows at that moment. Like, what's going to impact them more than not. Understanding, but that changes, and it's really up to the leader to be in touch with their team, and whether this is something that the leader does or the analyst does regularly, but setting up some kind of like, hey, what is my baseline? Just like in threat management, we look not just at what a POI does in like this crazy moment. We look at like, oh, what is their baseline? What is their norm? And what are the deviations from that? So, an analyst asking themselves, like, how much do I sleep? How much do I eat? How much am I drinking? How much, how often am I going out socially? So that you can realize, like, oh man, yeah, I don't sleep a lot. I only get 5 or 6 hours of sleep, but maybe that works for somebody. That would be awful for me. But somebody who like can function on 5 or 6 hours of sleep, all of a sudden getting 8 hours of sleep or 9 hours of sleep, when we're like, yay, you're getting 8, 9 hours of sleep. But that's a whole lot more than they're used to. So like what happened there? Is this just what I would call a normal sleeping pattern, or is this the impact from what they've been working on? And are we monitoring ourselves? And again, as a leader, are you monitoring your team for these types of changes?
Yeah, that's so. It's such a good point about that, the baseline, and your analogy of threat management, I really, I think, is so apt. And I want to add to it, when not only when we're assessing a threat and trying to figure out how to reduce risk, right? We look at not only kind of baseline and what's aberrant for someone, but at the same time, we also look at what's working for them, what protective factors are there. And I think that we need to do that with our with our teammates as well, and kind of look at what's working for them. So, Ariane, let me ask you here. Tell me about how as a leader in the security field and leading a team, how do you bring this to your team in terms of like, if you're worried about one of your team members, one of your employees, what do you do?
I ask them, how are they doing? And some are, going back to what Brian said, like the responses and the way people react is going to be different for everybody. So there's not, you're asking me a very general, because there's not one right approach, for everyone. It's really going to depend on the person, the situation, what's happening around, that will guide, how I approach or respond to somebody. But I think generally, having like a multi-layered approach that ensures that, number one, people know that there's resources that are there, knowing that you're on a team that values wellness, and that is a take care of you first team, values health and wellness over production. And then also knowing that you can raise your hand and say, I can step away. And I think that's sort of like where it needs to start, in that preventative piece and that upstream piece of just, hey, if I'm creating an environment where folks can feel like they can say it, versus me trying to ask and keep prodding, and I would rather have that environment than the other. Then it's got to start there. And again, just recognizing that everybody is going to respond differently and take in the stress differently. And so setting up and having multiple different ways to support somebody is going to be key.
I think that's so important. It is that case by case approach, but just, you're also talking about really building a caring culture. You're caring about and caring for your team. Brian, I want to ask you. You have talked about a number of resources, and you've talked about how when you went through this yourself, you started to dig in as an analyst and try to learn as much as you can. What resources do you see? What would you recommend to security leaders, to security practitioners? And I'll say that we will include in our write-up of this, we'll include a link to a list that we'll do, but love to hear, what have you found useful as you've gone through all this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's a couple things, a handful of things, a lot of things that leaders need to do, but analysts themselves need to do. Yes, there's when you bring somebody new into the field, letting them know kind of what they're getting into. getting that self-assessment, get that baseline there. As you start doing investigations and people start getting into deeper work, have them partner up. There is, I hate to say socializing trauma, but working with somebody has been shown to help kind of reduce the longer term impacts, and it speeds up that processing. Get socializing events, whether in person or virtual, just so folks have some joy and fun around their work. Some people just check in, doom and gloom, and then check out. Have those surveys going through as far as those updates and checking in on what the baseline is doing. Make sure that some of the resources out, further resources I'm going to hit on in a sec are always available. Have it on like some sort of like internal website or team chat. Have that always there. So at midnight, and one of your analysts say, "I'm not doing well. What are the resources I have available?" Have a plan in place before you have to pull somebody. Like have that kind of crisis plan in place so you know exactly what you're doing. If you do need to say this, we need to get some help for this person, because it will be on the leaders sometimes, as you mentioned. We're the worst ones to self-assess, even if we try, but, be that outside example. Build in non-work hours, give people who are dealing with this content a lot of space to, maybe it's go for a walk, maybe it's meditate, I don't know, go learn something that is completely not security related, or just something that they're interested in. Give them an hour or two a week. It's just a good little break. As you mentioned, kind of you get what you celebrate, keep celebrating that stuff. Provide as much impact or information on the impact of the work that you're doing. Because I think, especially in private sector, and I think especially in protective services, we kind of feed up this information and it's kind of lost. And we look at something that's, very traumatic, and then we're just stuck with it. But hearing some of that good news is helpful. It shows that there's reason and meaning behind the work that somebody's working on. I had a manager earlier in my LinkedIn career who would send out emails with just random good news, like bring some positivity in the space. Get trigger warnings on the content that you're working on. And then again, like we mentioned, have a deep enough of a bench so that you can pull somebody off the front lines. As far as the analyst goes, know your no-go zones. Like, know that those are going to change. Be purposeful when you're going into traumatic content, and just in general in social media. Be purposeful when you go in there. As far as like little tactical things that an analyst can do, minimize the traumatic content, like quite literally, like make it a smaller window. Turn off the audio if you're starting to get into videos and whatnot. Use grayscale on your computer or your browser or whatnot. If you're getting into a video, try and use some thumbnails. If you have an image that you have to look at, but the part that you look at doesn't need to be the traumatic stuff, get a Post-it note and slap it on your screen so you don't continuously see that. Get another window to kind of cover over that. Make sure that you're slowing down, you're taking breaks. Joke, have fun. Yes, I understand there's gallows humor that exists in the in the security space. So just making sure that, as far as like the books and websites I've gone to pull all this information from, I am not a psychological expert. I am just standing on the shoulders of giants here. But the book that I mentioned before, Graphic, by Dr. Alexa Koenig and Andrea Lampos, Behave by Dr. Robert Sapolsky, helped me a lot with just how does the brain work. As I mentioned before, What My Bones Know by Stephanie Fu. Great book on complex PTSD. There's a website and best practices by called Rated R by Lily Siri Spira, Rachel Corneo, and Pearl Wezigwe. They're out of also Berkeley. And as far as I mentioned, the stealing from other professions and not reinventing the wheel. out of Columbia School of Journalism, there's the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma. Some just amazing resources there. And all these ideas are mostly coming from these like amazing professionals who have been studying this stuff. And I'm hoping that we can start bringing into the security space.
Brian, that list is absolutely amazing and incredibly helpful. I learned a ton of things, and I wish that, I'd known those much earlier in my career. Incredibly helpful. We'll include that list in our write up too, and include other lists. Arian, let me throw this last question to you first. Anything else that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Yeah, I would just reiterate that it starts with leadership. And a leader, you don't have to be, leading a team to be a leader. I think a leader is also somebody that brings attention to the situation. Like raise your hand and say like, hey, like we're dealing with some stuff right now, and we need help. So raising your hand to say that you need help, but just prioritizing that wellness and modeling those behaviors. I can't speak highly enough too, but also knowing your people, paying attention to baseline behavior changes, and if you see any of those changes, asking them if they need help, but then also turning it around on yourself as a leader, and asking yourself, like, is there anything that I am doing or that I am creating that is adding to, or that could be contributing to the stress climate, of the team. And really just, having that self-awareness and that humility to continue to ask yourselves that, because sometimes, I think we get wrapped up in the quote unquote emergencies or crises when they really aren't emergencies or crises. I really don't need that by end of day, like those types of things. And I think it speaks to prioritization of the work and really focusing on like the most impactful work versus trying to do everything, and helping your team through that. So, I mean, I think it just really starts with leadership. And if there are leaders listening, it starts with you. And how are you creating environment? How are you impacting the environment of your team? Because you can do something about it.
That is such great guidance. Brian, any further thoughts?
I think I ran off for a good semi tangent there. Hopefully all those are useful tips. But I think as far as starting off, Arian hit it right in the head. And to steal a phrase from the Army, what right looks like, Arian is absolutely one of the folks who has been championing this so well. And it's been awesome to be able to chat with her and work on this stuff. So, to be somewhat self-promotional, hop on LinkedIn and follow her. And but also now, just as if folks or individuals want to chat about it, they're in a situation. I am also on LinkedIn, shocker, and and people can connect and reach out, and I do try and be uh, open about kind of this process, and as far as that I've been going through since October, and getting back on my feet, and so yeah, I think it starts with leadership. Do the right thing for your people. I'm sure I'll like, this isn't what my bosses want to hear, but I work for my team. I don't work for LinkedIn, is how I feel about it. And so do that. And then analysts, it is on individuals. We got to do a little bit to make sure we're taking care of ourselves and our teammates. So yeah, I hope these tips and these resources are helpful. And I'm always here to chat if there's somebody that kind of needs to, or taking a look at what their program looks like, and maybe some things that we can all do a little bit better.
Brian, thank you. And Arian, thank you. And I just wanted to say both of you are wonderful examples of walking the walk in this this very, very, very important issue. And my hope is, I hope this episode in particular, that for the folks who have listened in, please share this far and wide with your team, with other leaders, colleagues, and other organizations. This is such important information that we're able to discuss today. So I hope you do. And we do have coming up, we had a panel on this topic at the ONTIC Summit, and we're going to be doing another version of it at GSX in September. Panel is called Guarding the Guardians. So if you're going to be at GSX, please come sit in. It'd be great to see you. Brian Parent, Arian Avila, thank you so much for your time, for your expertise, and for the level of caring and passion that you are bringing to this vital topic. Thank you both.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you. It's been great.
This episode was brought to you by the ONTIC Center for Connected Intelligence. Learn more at ontic.co/center. Again, that's ontic.co/center. It was produced by AJ McKeon. Our music is a track called Monteverde Ride. It was written by Brian Bristow and performed by the Smoke and Novas. You can check them out on Spotify. Please remember to rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you choose to enjoy your podcasts. If you have questions, we'd love to hear them. You can reach us at podcast@ontic.co or visit ontic.co/center for more information. Thanks for listening.